absolutely delighted to be with you today. This is the fourth of the dialogues organised by Bharat Kisak Samaj and more recently with the Food and Land Use Coalition that I've been able to be at. And I am so pleased because this is really one of the most extraordinary opportunities that we have in today's world to look at food systems and to feel them transforming as we go about our work. It's what is happening and it's where we're at today. So I'm David Nabarro and I work on food and have been doing so since 2008. Originally I'm a public health doctor and I've spent many years in this region, particularly in India and Nepal. And I really owe a huge debt of gratitude to everybody here for the way you've taught me much of what I know. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to spend a moment or two with you today as we get going. Food is now being dealt with in multiple settings as a systems issue, which means that we've moved from looking at food as fundamentally a production challenge, and instead we look at the nutritional, environmental, climatic, gender, youth, and equity implications of food, and we deal with that as the normal way of working on the issue. It's not easy. And when we came together in 2021 in the first ever United Nations Food Systems Summit, we had to cope with the fact that multiple groups were made uncomfortable by the shift to thinking in terms of systems, and some wanted to boycott the process because they did not like the starting conditions. And so to work with food as a systems issue, the most important requirement from the beginning is to recognise there are multiple perspectives on what we're trying to do, and it's best if we basically treat all those perspectives as though they are okay. Because if we go into dealing with food as a systems issue and set preconditions for our engagement, then it just doesn't work. We have to be able to be wide angle in our thinking and multi-perspective in our approach. And then, what does it mean when we deal with food as a systems issue? It means that we spend time trying to understand the trade-offs that have to be taken into account whenever decisions are made. And we watch over time as the nature of the trade-offs changes. We've seen, for example, in the last few years, much more questioning about the role of livestock, and in particular livestock products, especially red meat and dairy, in our food systems. And there are more and more questions being asked about what is the right balance of livestock in a modern food system. And those places that have invested hugely in intensive livestock production are having to look again and question whether perhaps they're going to end up with a lot of stranded assets. That's what food systems working is about, is feeling the change in the context within which decisions are made. And watching as the trade-offs change, because in particular, people demand different patterns of food people demand different patterns of farming, and that then plays through to the decision making, and it plays through to those decisions at local, national and global levels. In the food systems work that I've watched over the last few years, what really matters is the way in which different countries are handling the trade-offs. It's a country-by-country exercise. India has emerged as an extraordinary leader, partly because of the diversity of situations in this country, and partly because India has found itself in really important positions, particularly chairing the G20 up until the 1st of December this year. So that's why these dialogues that have taken place in 2019, 2020, 2022, and now 2023, with a virtual dialogue in the middle, that's why these dialogues become so relevant. The convening power of Bharat Kishak Samaj is extraordinary. But it's not to be taken for granted. We need to ask ourselves, why has this series of dialogues by BKS been so powerful? Firstly, the chair of BKS wants to engage as wide a community of stakeholders as possible. Secondly, he engages the stakeholders without trying to control the way in which they're engaged. And I just want to spend a very short time thinking about what that means. You invite people to come in for a dialogue, but you don't tell them what you want them to talk about, you let them sort it out. For me, that is really good systems leadership. And I'd like to encourage you all to reflect on what letting go with confidence means in practice. In the case of the dialogues here, it's associated with more and more groups wanting to be part of the process. And this combination of BKS and the Food and Land Use Coalition is super special, because the Food and Land Use Coalition is a science-based, multi-actor international force, and BKS is a farmers' forum for India, and the combination is particularly powerful. So thank you to all from Bharat Kishak Samaj. Thanks to Jai Kumar and others, where are you, from FOLU, and everything that you're doing. Thank you to all of you who've joined, particularly those of you who come representing non-governmental groups like the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation, but also the different ICAR institutes. Thank you in particular to Nanda Kumar, who's been here as a constant inspiration and leader in this process. So we're about to go into the first session, and I'm just going to tell you who's here and who's going to be participating. First of all, I'm very pleased that we're going to be hearing a keynote presentation from Professor Prabhu Pingali, who is director of the Tata-Cornell Institute, and he's going to focus on food systems transformation in India. And having looked at some of the books that he's written, in particular the most recent book on food systems transformation in this country, I can tell you we're going to have a really brilliant presentation starting shortly. But we've also going to hear from Morgan Gillespy, the Executive Director of the Food and Land Use Coalition. She's going to speak on a video, which is all ready, and we will start with that. most importantly, we're blessed by being able to hear from T. Nanda Kumar, who's former Secretary of the Union Ministry of Agriculture, and he will be providing a steer for what we're going to do. And that's great because he's President of Bharat Kisak Samaj, and he's also a Senior Fellow of the Food and Land Use Coalition. So he is well placed to do this. So I'd like to invite Nanda Kumar and Prabhu Pingali to come and join me up here on the stage. Actually, I don't want to, sorry, because we're going to see the video first, and you would be stuck having the video projected in your eyes. So let's get you up after the video. Let's now hear from Morgan Gillespy, Executive Director of the Food and Land Use Coalition. The title of her presentation is Global Food Systems Transformation and Climate COP28, Some Reflections. Let's see it now. Thank you. I'll tell you a secret. My plane touched down at 5:30 this morning. So if I appear a little bit strained, I'm sorry for that. Now we go to Morgan Gillespy. Thank you. We might want to go back again and turn the volume up.
Food Systems Dialogue India 2023. I'm very sorry that I can't be there in person. I've just returned from Dubai, from COP28, where food systems finally took center stage. And I want to take the next couple of minutes to talk you through some of the most exciting advancements we saw over the last few weeks. Now, firstly, there has been a declaration integrating food systems into the UNFCCC process. 159 countries signed this declaration, committing to put food systems into the heart of their NDCs by 2025. This is a world's first and seeks to raise the floor as to what's possible to drive forward food systems transformation. Now, 159 countries signing this declaration, of course, is not enough. This was supported by a non-state actor call to action, signed by more than 200 institutions, including businesses, financial institutions, farmers, indigenous people, cities, and youth. The supporting call to action articulated ways in which non-state actors can meaningfully contribute to food systems transformation. Now, committing to act, as we know, is not acting in and of itself. And so I'm delighted to also share the launch of a new alliance, an alliance of champions. 5 countries have formed this alliance and will be implementing the transformation of food systems both domestically and abroad in the coming years. Co-chaired by the governments of Brazil, Norway, and Sierra Leone, and supported by founding members Cambodia and Rwanda. These countries are committing to act across 10 priority intervention areas validated by the CGIAR, and will be reporting back on progress on an annual basis. With this declaration, with the supporting non-state actor call to action, and with this vanguard group of countries showing the way for others to follow suit, we have an integrated architecture showing how food systems transformation can be implemented. Now, with that architecture, it's also important to focus on the content. What comprises food systems transformation? From FOLU's perspective, we frame our work around 10 critical transformation areas, transition areas. A focus on shifting towards affordable, healthy, and nutritious diets. And with that focus on healthy and nutritious diets, thinking critically about how to produce that food. So our second critical transition is to focus on scaling productive and regenerative agriculture. And we know that we need to increase our productivity if we are to feed successfully a growing population. But we can't do it by further encroaching on our natural land. And so our third critical transition is to protect and restore nature, ensuring that we halt tropical deforestation and land conversion by 2025. Now with those three frames, healthy and nutritious diets, how do we get there? We scale productive and regenerative agriculture, and how must we do that? By protecting and restoring nature. We also focus on reducing food loss and food waste. And you don't need me to tell you that there's an SDG that supports this. So again, with COP28, we have a declaration, a non-state actor call to action, an alliance of champions of countries implementing this transformation. There was also a lot of great work done on the what, these critical transitions of healthy and nutritious diets, productive and regenerative agriculture, protecting and restoring nature, and reducing food loss and food waste. On reducing food loss and food waste, a philanthropic roadmap was announced, providing a pathway to achieve SDG 12.3 focused on 7 countries. It called for an investment of $300 million so that these countries could deliver 50% reduction in food loss and food waste by 2023. On scaling productive and regenerative agriculture, there were 3 new announcements. The first from philanthropy. A group of 24 philanthropists came together and collaborated to create a theory of transformation to understand how they could better align their giving so that they could scale the implementation of regenerative agriculture in a number of different landscapes. 2, WBCSD, in collaboration with BCG and the COP28 presidency, launched a corporate-facing initiative articulating the number of hectares committed by corporates to be transformed into regenerative landscapes in the coming future, matched by the financial commitments made by those companies. And 3, via Regen 10, a collaborative platform, the release of a zero-draft, farmer-centric, outcomes-based framework. This framework works at farm and at landscape levels to help farmers collect primary data from their farms so that they can understand how their practices are achieving deep regenerative results, looking at environmental, sociocultural, and economic outcomes, recognizing that livelihoods is as equally important as the environment. On healthy and nutritious diets, there was another global declaration bringing health to the debate for the first time, linking climate and health. And so you see with this COP a number of outcomes, of exciting initiatives, of commitments to act, and of mechanisms to implement in the coming years. Now, we've also found out that COP29 is going to take place in Azerbaijan and Baku, and we know that COP30 will take place in Brazil, where the ministries of Brazil are already calling COP30 a nature COP. So with this declaration, with a call to action from non-state actors, with the alliance of champions, and with the infrastructure supporting healthy and nutritious diets, productive and regenerative agriculture, protecting and restoring nature, and tackling food loss and food waste, I have huge ambition, hope, and excitement that we will really start to transform our domestic, national, and international food systems. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of series. I'm sorry again that I can't be there in person. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much indeed for that. That's Morgan Gillespy. She's Global Director of the Food and Land Use Coalition, and she was very much in a visible leading role in the Dubai Climate COP that's just completed. I'm now going to invite Prabhu Pingali and Nanda Kumar to come up and sit, if they wouldn't mind, in the 2 chairs to the left of me here. And we're going to hear first from Nanda Kumar, but I just, everybody knows him, but I'd like to just say a couple of words about him. For me, Nanda Kumar is one of these wonderful people that helps me make sense of what's happening in the world, and he's done so in successive moments of these dialogues organised by Bharat Kisak Samaj. He's retired IAS, he was Secretary for Industries, he was Additional Chief Secretary to the Government of Jharkhand, and he was appointed the Food Secretary of Government of India in 2006 and Agricultural Secretary in 2008. He's also served as Chair of the Spices Board in Cochin, and the board was able to increase its exports consistently because of his efforts. He's been in the National Disaster Management Authority with the rank of Minister of State in the Government of India, and he's did some very important work on the impact of the Uruguay round on the global spice trade, which was published by the International Trade Center in Geneva in the form of a book quite recently. So I'm going to invite Nanda Kumar to help us find our way into today's discussions, context setting for the Food Systems Dialogues 2023. Please give him a big round of applause. Nanda Kumar.
Thank you, David, for that wonderful introduction. I thought you would say I'm a friend of yours, and that would have been the one sentence introduction that I wanted to hear. Anyway, thank you very much.
That's coming at the end.
Okay.
Provided you say the right thing.
Yeah, that's exactly what we don't want to hear. You say what you want to say. Thank you for introducing the dialogues. I think when we started in 2018, many people told us that the food system transformation is a no-go as far as India is concerned. And this was told to me by good friends, well-wishers, people in positions of authority. But I think Ajay had his ambition set very high, and we decided to go ahead with 4 sessions. One, of course, in between was COVID affected, and therefore on a virtual mode. The last one was the most ambitious one, which had 11 partners and 200 resource persons and 10 different sessions. We went big, then we realized that we couldn't handle that kind of volume and space. So this year we thought we would come back to a smaller group of people and do something more manageable. But that's not to say this is less important, because most importantly, the Bharat Krishak Samaj as a platform likes to have diverse opinions reflected here, and it's important that the platform stays neutral. Of course, there are concerns that we have, there are issues that we need to address which are common to everybody, but that doesn't in any way restrict anyone from saying things in a manner which is appropriate for a forum like this. In fact, the learning that we had in the last session in particular was that though we didn't come to a set of conclusions per se that normally happen in many conferences, many people went back, almost everybody went back, with a slight change in his own outlook, which he heard from other people. And that's what this dialogue is all about. Now, we are meeting this time. In fact, we are slightly late in our schedule. We had to shift it because of COP28. We wanted to understand what's happening there, and thank you, David, for explaining, and also Morgan for explaining what happened in COP28, how there is still some hope in terms of the food system and its interface with the climate. Well, clearly there is a declaration on sustainable agriculture, resilient food systems and climate action, which does recognize that food systems are important in the current context of climate. There is also the general declaration which underlines that farmers, including fisher folk and other food producers, could be affected by climate change, and we need to ensure food security and nutrition by increasing overall support to vulnerable people. Now, this is the global understanding as it stands today, and India, of course, has its own set of commitments, including carbon neutrality by 2070 and restoring a huge quantity of degraded soil back to arable land, creating additional carbon sinks and increasing its forest cover. Now, with these kind of commitments that India has made, I'm sure that food transformation within India, food system transformations, will happen, probably not as a national effort, but as a series of local efforts which conform to the basic principles of what we are trying to do. And this is exactly, I think, that we said in the concluding session of the last meeting, that we need a food system transformation, but more locally aligned and locally anchored than a national policy on food system transformation. We do understand that national policies do impact food systems, but more and more local initiatives are likely to take place. Because India has a peculiar challenge, and therefore some of the global solutions may find a certain amount of reluctance in terms of adaptability. The reason being that with a very small percentage of the world's geographical area and less than 4% of world's renewable freshwater resource, we have to feed our 17 or 18% of world's population. And that poses in itself a major challenge. Plus, look at the levels of hunger and undernutrition, not so much hunger, but more undernutrition, and that poses yet another set of challenges. So it's not possible to ignore some of these challenges and shift entirely to a system which is, yes, pro-planet, but not necessarily pro-human. And this kind of finding a balance between the two is going to be the challenge for India. Therefore, I do think that our systems will transform, keeping in mind the economy and well-being of our farmers, food and nutrition security of our people, and care for nature and planet in this part of the world. Therefore, the challenge for us would be to devise our own, call it theory of change or theory of transformation, that can meet the aspirations of the people of this country. And I do understand that it's very complex, there are multiple players, and we are all the time trying to find some areas of convergence between various players. But I do believe, and I say this because I was recently in a workshop on soils with some farmers, and I do understand that they are the people who are facing the climate and climate change every day of the year. And they are the people constantly in the quest for producing food for most of us. So change will happen at the intersection of the farmer with nature in his own field. And that change is what we need to absorb and bring it back to this dialogue. And you would probably hear a little bit about the food system transformation hub, which we are planning, and that could then absorb a lot of these learnings from the field, from the farmers' fields, from smaller localities, and then bring it on to what should the policy change to enable such transformation. So I'm very hopeful of very useful and a very productive dialogue, listening to different perspectives from different people. It's deliberate that we have only about 75 people who will be attending this, but that will give you enough space to talk about things that are of importance to you, that are of concern to you, and probably bring much more of your experience and focus to this discussion. Thank you very much.
Such a lovely introductory statement from my friend and philosopher and guide, T. Nanda Kumar. For me, the explanation that we are looking at issues that are relevant for food producers, for the people who consume food, and for the planet, and trying to find the sweet spot where all those interests come together, is the central feature of this. And Nanda Kumar said it, we've got different perspectives on how to handle the balance, and they are inevitably extremely tricky and quite political, and that's why doing the dialogues and doing it from the multiple different perspectives is the right thing to do, and creating the space where people who don't agree can at least have a dialogue over 3 days is the way forward. And to help us get off on a good start, we've got the joy of hearing from Prabhu Pingali. He's Professor of International Development Economics at Cornell University. He's the founding director of the Tata-Cornell Institute for Agriculture and Nutrition. He's had director level positions with several agricultural development organisations. I first got to know Prabhu when he was at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, after also serving in the Food and Agriculture Organisation and the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research. He's chair of the governing board of ICRISAT, and he's recently been elected as fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In my view, an absolutely prestigious group to be a member of. He's a member of the US National Academy of Sciences and India's National Academy of Agricultural Sciences. And those of you who've been looking up Prabhu on the web will see that he's published a lot of books, and recently particularly on transformation in Indian agriculture. Please welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Prabhu Pingali.
Thank you, David, for such a generous introduction. I'm going to use some slides, so maybe it's best to sit. Okay. I usually have someone calling me just as I talk. Thank you also to BKS and FOLU for inviting me to this conference. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be in Delhi. There's a lot of things one can talk about when we talk about food systems and food system transformation. It's a topic that's gained so much momentum over the last decade. I've been in this business of food and agriculture for 45 years now. For the first 40 years, people barely talked about food and agriculture outside of the agriculture and agricultural economics community. Now you have everyone from philosophers to medical doctors to nutritionists, everyone talking about food and agriculture. Climate change people, So food is now central to all major discussions about what's happening to the world and the future of the world and the state of sustainability in the world. So we're in a very exciting time period. And I can spend a lot of time talking about these issues. But I've decided to pick a few key points to talk about today. I decided to talk about, one, the rising demand for food and the rising demand for diversity. A lot of the discussion on food systems doesn't seem to spend enough time talking about what's driving food system change. And that's demand side. And those demand side factors are really important. The second is what's happening to nutrition and the need for affordable nutrition, especially for the poor. That's really important. The third, and this is a really India-specific issue. A large part of agriculture in India is driven by the needs of the food-based safety net programs. A large part of what we produce is driven by the needs of the PDS and the needs of the midday meal program. And how do we reimagine these programs is an important way of thinking about food systems in the future. And the last that I want to talk about is this interface between climate and agriculture and the seeming dichotomy between increasing productivity versus managing climate change. And I'll argue that one can get to a place where you can achieve both. You can achieve food security and still have climate mitigation and a climate resilient agriculture system. So let me start with the demand side of the story. India is going through this tremendous change in demography and where people live. We've seen in the last 5 decades this movement of populations from predominantly rural-oriented societies to increasing urbanization in India. And this graph here shows you, this map shows you very clearly the extent to which urbanization is happening. Today, even though the statistics say we are 70% rural, the reality is that most households in India have members that are living in urban areas, in towns, mid-level cities and metropolis cities, etc. And the demand for food in these areas, especially as incomes are rising, is driving much of the food system change. And some of the big demand drivers are the fact that as incomes rise, you see an increased demand for diversity of diets, increased demand for fruits, vegetables, livestock products, milk, etc. And this is a global phenomenon. There are 2 global phenomena that India is experiencing as we speak. The first global phenomenon is what we economists call the Engels' law. Engels' law says that as incomes rise, the share of income spent on food falls. This doesn't mean the absolute amount that you spend on food falls, but the share falls because your total income is rising. And you see India following the same pattern. When you look at the NSS data going from the 70s up to 2011-12, you see both for rural India and urban India that share of income spent on food is dropping. And at the same time, you have the second phenomenon, which is also a global phenomenon, and that's called Bennett's law. Bennett's law says that as incomes rise, the share of income that you spend on starchy staples falls relative to non-staples, a more diverse diet. And you see India following exactly the same trend that you see around the world. So in terms of this global phenomenon, India is following a pattern which is well established across the world. I wish we had more NSS data. I wish the government continued to produce solid, nationally representative data that we can continue to see what's happening to food and agriculture, incomes, poverty, etc. And I hope all of us can ask for that data to be generated because it's so important for us to understand these trends. But one of the things that that's happened as you look at this data is not only are you seeing an increased consumption of fruits and vegetables and increased protein, but a worrying trend of increased consumption of processed foods. And that increased consumption of processed food is that very dark line at the dark space at the top. And that's increasing, and it's increasing for many reasons, including opportunity cost of time for women, urbanization, and all of that. But it's also increasing, and here's the data on how much that processed food and packaged food consumption is increasing across the country. And that continues to rise. And that part of the reason it's rising is that as urbanization happens, as the provision of food to urban areas is through more organized retail, supermarkets, but also other types of shops, etc. Much of this products that are sold in these areas are these long shelf life products, flour, oils, noodles, etc. But not so much perishable products. So perishable products still tend to be street markets, still tend to be wet markets, etc. And so you don't see that the supply of vegetables, fruit, etc. is keeping up to the rising demand as much as the supply of processed foods. And that processed food supply is not only in urban areas but also in rural areas. And that spread is then leading to significant nutritional changes. So we still keep thinking about India as a country where there's undernutrition and undernourishment. And that's true. We still have large sections of populations that are malnourished in one way or the other. But we're also seeing the switch to overnutrition and overweight. And I think when we think about food policy, we need to be thinking about food policy both in terms of addressing undernutrition, but also in terms of addressing overnutrition. And in my view, the answer to both is the same. The answer to both is increased access and affordability of more nutritious food, especially fresh food. And that's something I'll come back to. Now, one thing, when you look across the country, you see very different scenarios. So if you look at the top part of this graph here, you have states like Jharkhand, Bihar, Orissa, etc. And these states still are less developed, they're still emerging in terms of overall development within the country. And these states still have very high levels of malnutrition and lower levels of overnutrition. But as you come down to the lower parts of this graph, you're looking at Punjab, Haryana, Tamil Nadu, Andhra, etc., which are much more progressive states, much more urbanized states. And in these areas, the problem of overnutrition has become much, much greater. So as you look across the country, it's not one solution fits all, but the type of food policy and the way we think about food policy is extremely context specific. And we need to be aware of that as we look forward. The other issue, I think, as you think about nutrition, is nutrition tends to be gender specific. There is significant differences between the nutrition outcome for men versus women. And there are intra-household differences in nutrition outcomes. And some of the data from the National Family Health Survey shows you what's happening to nutrition levels across the country. And you find that in the more progressive states in the country, the level of diet diversity is much higher relative to the lagging states for women. But a very interesting phenomenon is when you empower women, and empower women through improved literacy, improved access to resources, assets, etc., then women's empowerment drives better nutrition outcomes. And some of the work that was done by Sudha Narayan in terms of measuring Women's Empowerment in Nutrition Index is the index that we used in our work, and we can show through a series of papers, we've shown that as empowerment of women increases, their own nutritional outcomes improve, but also the nutritional outcomes of the overall family improves. Now, this is not an exact one-to-one match. You do see some states within the country where you have high levels of empowerment but lower diet diversity, but it's a phenomenon that's becoming more general. So when we think about food systems, we're not only thinking about food and quantity of food and quality of food, but also we need to be thinking about behavior change and empowerment as an integral part of how we look at food systems. Many of you here have seen the Eat Lancet report. I know that last year there was a big presentation on the Eat Lancet report. And the Eat Lancet report has some very strong recommendations on what is a good diet, right? What's a recommended diet? The National Institute of Nutrition in India has a similar set of recommendations. So what we did was to say, okay, if you have an Eat Lancet recommendation, is that affordable to a common person in India? So we took two levels of the Eat Lancet diet. We looked at, for each food group, the average price of that food group, which is the left side, leftmost column. And right next to that, for each food group, we took the minimum price food in that food group. So think about the minimum price of food in each food group. And if you look at that number, it turns out that to meet the Eat Lancet recommendation, a common Indian adult, an average Indian adult, would need around $3.5 per person per day to meet the Eat Lancet recommendation. Today, they are spending around 75 cents per day. So to meet the Eat Lancet recommendation, you need to spend 3 to 4 to 5 times as much. How are we ever going to do that? And we have similar results for using the NIN recommendation. Same issue. So the challenge for us when we think about nutrition is how do you get more affordable food, more nutritious food to the poor? And that would need an enormous increase in supply of food. And the challenge we are facing is that the demand for better diet is there and rising. The demand for fruits, vegetables, etc. is rising. But the supply is not keeping up. And because the supply is not keeping up, you see this rise in prices and extreme volatility in prices, especially for vegetables. And you see that periodically across the country, and quite often big newspaper reports around onion prices going through the roof or potato prices going through the roof, etc. And that's something we're living with. And part of the reason we're living with this is because of the way our agriculture system is structured. The agriculture system in India is very much a legacy of the Green Revolution. It's very much a legacy of the focus on producing staple grains. Now, I'm not saying that that was not the right focus when you think about the 70s, 80s, 90s, etc. But as you think about the need for more diversity today, then how do we create diversity in the food system, even as we try to meet the needs of staple grain across the whole country? So that's the challenge I think we need to be looking at. And this graph shows you that over time, millets, sorghum, pulses, etc. have dropped in area and in production relative to the staple grains. And that's an issue that we need to be addressing. And the way one would address that is to take another look at food and agriculture policies today. food and agriculture policies today are still very much staple grain focused. Can we repurpose these policies? Can we repurpose these subsidies in order to be able to get to a much more level playing field? What I've been calling crop neutral agriculture policy, where you provide the incentives and the infrastructure for enhancing productivity, but you don't focus it on particular crops. You let the market demand drive what's produced rather than dictates on what's produced from the top. So there are options here. There are options for enhancing productivity. But remember, the demand for food in urban areas can only be met by small farmers across India diversifying their own production systems and connecting to markets. Because India will continue to be a small farm agriculture system. There are other countries which have had similar models. Japan, Korea, China, etc. continue to have small farm agriculture even as they've developed. But they continue to have small farm agriculture because of massive investments in infrastructure, because of markets and market infrastructure that's been developed, especially local and rural markets, because of creating scale with small farmers. Small farmers still operate their own farms, but they can act as a group in access to inputs, access to outputs, and output markets, etc. And that's where farmer-producer organizations or similar models come in, and I know India is making a big effort in this area. And then investment in improved skills, improved knowledge, etc., for making that diversity in production happen. And then food quality standards, safety standards. This is, I think, the fundamental components of a food policy that needs to be in place if we want to enhance overall supply of more perishable, more nutritious food. Let me now quickly go to the issue of the public distribution system. I think what surprised me the most as we think about the public distribution system is that in India today, around 44% of all rice that's produced in the country goes into the PDS or the midday meal scheme. It goes into the procurement system. And around 41% of all wheat that's produced goes into the government procurement system. That's an enormous amount of procurement that's happening. And that then feeds into the PDS, the midday meal schemes, and all the other safety net programs. Right. But it also has significant costs because much of this supply is coming from very few states. Punjab, Haryana, some from Madhya Pradesh, some from Andhra, etc. And the resource costs, the environmental costs in these areas is extremely high. Water, depletion, degradation, soil quality loss, etc. And that's a big challenge. And one of the things that we've done in our group, Raghav Puri, who's here, is holding a session on Wednesday where we'll talk through the true costs of the PDS and what are the alternatives to the PDS system. And the true costs are enormous. If we measure it in terms of rupees, it's around, I think it translates to 3 lakh crore rupees per year of total costs of the PDS. That includes about 1.3 lakh crores of actual costs and twice as much in terms of hidden costs. Costs to the fertilizer subsidies, costs in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, costs in terms of depletion of water resources, crop residue burning, etc. And these are only the costs you can measure. There are lots of other costs that we can't even measure, right? So this is a big issue, and our group has been doing quite a lot of analytical work in this area, and we'll be having a discussion on that coming up. So what do we do about it? How do we change this? One is a discussion that's already happening, looking at millets and other non-rice and wheat type of staples coming into the PDS. And there is an opportunity for that. Again, that we'll talk about the practicality of that on Wednesday. But the other way to think about it is local procurement, rather than focusing on PDS procurement from a few states, to look at whether each state can have its own procurement system. And the economics of that need to be addressed. But there's a third way. The third way is to be much better at producing rice and wheat. Can we be more efficient in terms of water use, fertilizer use, etc., for our current production system? So thinking through all these angles is really important. Let me now come to the last part of my talk, which is climate and agriculture. One of the reasons food is so much on the agenda is because of that close link between food and climate. So agriculture certainly has a big impact on climate change in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. But climate change, rising temperatures, has a big impact on agriculture productivity. So we need to look at both the mitigation and adaptation issues together. And the data on greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture are very clear. Over time, we've seen significant increase in overall greenhouse gas emissions, both from the production side as well as the value chain side of agriculture system. And you see that, even as the share is declining, the absolute amount of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture is increasing. So a big challenge for us is how do you get to a net zero emission food systems, right? And an area that we've been working on is this area called zero hunger, zero carbon, where we try to address hunger goals while at the same time looking at net zero emissions from agriculture. And where are the emissions coming from? The emissions are coming from, the biggest part of the emissions are coming actually from the livestock sector. The second is from rice and rice paddies, and then fertilizer applications, but also organic manure applications. So it's not enough to say we switch to organic farming, because the way you manage manure also has a big impact on greenhouse gas emissions. And then other factors such as crop residue, burning, etc. come into play. But your big levers for change are better management of livestock, better management of rice systems, better management of fertilizer. These are your big levers of change as we look forward. So, what can we do about it? There are three avenues by which I think you can get to that net zero food system. One avenue is increasing productivity and input use efficiency. The more efficient you are in input use, the more productive you are, the lower emissions are per unit. So take livestock, for example. Right now, livestock productivity in India is extremely low. But if productivity per animal goes up, then you can actually see herd sizes dropping. So you may see a smaller population of animals, but an increased supply of milk. And that then has very strong benefits in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Similarly, better water management practices, fertilizer management practices, etc. are important. Second is to look at system change, to look at going from a rice-based system during the dry season to a more diversified production systems. One of the experiments that we are doing in Chhattisgarh is to look at moving from upland rice to millets. How would that lead to a reduction in overall greenhouse gas emissions? So that level of system change in terms of diversification would be an opportunity looking ahead. And it fits with the rising demand for diversity. So those two can link together. The third way to look at it is intersectoral synergies, especially on the energy sector. As as you see more renewable energy use, more use of solar power, etc., it can create synergies with agriculture. And a particularly exciting area here is agrovoltaics. Agrovoltaics is where you are jointly producing energy and food in the same field. So you're generating electricity from solar power and solar panels, but you're doing it in a way that you're also enhancing your overall crop productivity. And you're not sacrificing crop productivity for energy generation. So this whole area of agrovoltaics is becoming extremely big in the US and in Europe. And we've seen some really interesting examples of agrovoltaics in India and one or two right outside of Delhi. So that's an area I think there's a lot of exciting work that can be done. And in terms of adaptation to climate change, there's an enormous amount of work now already in place looking at adapting crops to rising temperatures, increased water shortages, etc. But also looking at ways in which you manage food systems under shock. And because of increased incidence of events such as droughts, floods, etc., food systems will be subject to frequent shocks. And the way we manage those shocks is an important part of adapting to climate change. Let me now just give you some concluding reflections. I think as we think about the food systems and we think about transformation of food systems, one of a really important issue that I've been thinking about is how one can get to convergence of global goals. When we talk about the SDGs, and the SDG 2 on hunger reduction has no connection to the SDGs on water, no connection to the SDGs on climate, etc. Each SDG is seen as a silo. And that's true at the UN level, but it's true at the country level. Country level goals are all seen as silos. Unless you have goals that intersect each other, unless you see goals converging, you cannot make progress on reducing the trade-offs across goals. And that would require not just conceptual convergence, like zero hunger, zero carbon, but you need convergence at the ministerial level. You need convergence of the agriculture ministry, the environment ministry, the health ministry, all sitting together at the same table and talking about what is a future food system that's relevant for the country, that's healthy, inclusive, sustainable, climate friendly, etc., and how do we get there? Just the agriculture ministry by itself will not be able to get there, and the environment ministry by itself will not be able to get there. So that convergence across sectors is really important. But we all know that transformation of food systems is also a political issue. There's a big political economy issues around policy change. And addressing these political economy constraints is a big part of what needs to happen. And I'm sure that's a big part of the discussion that will happen here over the next few days. And we have to also understand, as I showed you in different graphs, this country has different stages of overall transformation happening across the country. And so it's multiple countries all within one country. And so the way one thinks about transformative change would be different if you think about Eastern India relative to Southern India relative to Northwestern India. So it's not one solution fits all, but rather local context-specific solutions that need to be in place. And the last point I want to make is food system transformation requires behavior change. It requires behavior change at the consumer level in terms of what to consume, how to consume, etc. It requires behavior change at the producer level. It requires behavior change at the government level, at the civil society level, etc. So this behavior change across all levels is important as we think about our vision of a future food system and how to get there. With that, let me say thank you very much. I appreciate your attention.
So that's scholarship. And it's not just, please come, stay here, Prabhu. And Nanda, Kumar, please come. It's not just scholarship that's put into academic journals. It's the scholar comes here and shares with us in the most beautifully embracing way. So we're all part of it. And so we, even though we're running quite a bit to time, if there are any questions or requests for clarification, quickly now, please bring them up. Yep, and just if you could say your name and then make your point, then I will encourage the panelists to speak.
Yeah, my name is Shailesh. I'm from a company in Telecap. There are two things that I would like to ask. One is you're talking about livestock productivity increase. While it is required at a systems level, we'll also have to see the transition to, and we know that the soils are poor and most of the manure comes from livestock. When we reduce or when we increase the productivity with lesser number of animals, that may have a trade-off with the soil productivity. That is one. Second is that, and this is not a question, but when we are talking about convergence of different goals, which means that different ministries, different departments working together, a landscape approach, it sounds very, very tempting and very much important. But our experience to implement it in a shorter, in a smaller landscape such as Sundarbans has not yielded any result. So there are a lot of political and governance questions which we'll have to deal. So it's not a question, but it's basically very few examples exist where convergence of this kind has happened, and we are talking about very big thing when we are talking about that convergence. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we take a couple more questions and comments? One, and then we will invite the panelists. So, no? Behind you, though, is a gentleman with hand up, and then over there is the gentleman with hand up. And one more, so it's three. Lady, Katerina as well. And Prabhu needs a pen urgently.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Ramesh Rawal, who worked for BAIF and NGO. I think very good presentation, Dr. Pingali. You got a very good points and thoughtful discussions. One point which I thought it might be in some of the point I might have missed it, but the question that I find the missing point is the drainage system that has got really is a great bottleneck for improving soils and increasing land under area, particularly in all this, but particularly in case of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, which are more flood-prone areas, and this what you call it devaluation of drainage system is creating a lot of problems for the agriculture production.
Did you get the system? Yeah. That's good. So gentleman in the back. Oh, two gentlemen in the back. I don't know how we're going to do that. And then not forgetting Katerina. So you first, then Katerina, then, yeah. And this is, yeah. Introduce yourself.
Dr. Fabrice the Clerk from Eaton CJR. So Dr. Pingali, I enjoyed your presentation. You didn't mention carbon capture in agriculture or regenerative. Do you feel that it's not feasible, not at scale, or omission?
Thank you, Fabrice. Now to Katerina.
Katerina Ruggera-Derki from the Food System Economics Commission. Thank you so much, Professor Pingali, for your presentation. One thing that I thought you did not mention was in terms of demand changes. Some of those demand changes are not just the spontaneous urbanization and so on. They're very actively generated by a production system which tends to be highly concentrated and very powerful. So I think there is one more complexity in your last slide, which is the link between behavioral change and political economy. If you could give us your thoughts. Thank you.
You got that all? Yes. And now to the gentleman there with the...
All right, thank you very much. Ashish Gupta from Gram Desha Trust. It's interesting to see the narrative build up around livestock. One aspect which is clearly missing in the discourse, and this is a question perhaps for both the panelists, is that the pastoral systems is absolutely missing from the discourse. It's difficult to measure because of transhumance, they keep moving. Even government doesn't have statistics on them, but in the informal economy, they do exist. When you add them as a variable into the system, the dynamics of productivity for livestock, as well as the number of livestock and the diversity in it, changes completely. How do we start adding that to the narrative?
Very good. So there are 4 questions / comments. Prabhu, would you like to go first? And then Nanda, if you'd like to make any comments after Prabhu, that would be great. I don't know whether this microphone, that one works. Huh? Yeah.
So thank you all. I was given 20 minutes, so I can do a 2-hour talk and cover a lot more issues, and happy to do that. Can you hear me? Okay. So first on animal productivity and soil health. It's important that we are seeing this increased productive dairy systems that are coming into place. And once you see that, you're beginning to see much more stall-fed animals compared to open grazing animals. And manure management and bringing manure back to the field is an area that needs a lot of work. And BIFE, I know, is doing a lot of interesting work in this area, combining biogas production along with manure production. So as we think about organic inputs, the way we manage the manure from livestock and moving that into fields would be a way, I think, in which you can compensate for the soil fertility loss from having a larger herd. But I would suspect you would also have more productive manure coming from that. So that's something. I'm looking at the wrong person. You were the one who asked me that. Yeah. So that's a way I would think about that. On drainage systems, absolutely. I mean, we just came back from Bihar. We were in Samastipur last week. And it's very clear that Bihar agriculture is driven by flooding that comes from the Himalayas. So wet season, the opportunities in the eastern Indo-Gangetic plains for doing anything other than rice production are very limited in lowland areas. But it's the dry season that gives you the opportunities for change. In the dry season, the opportunities to diversify out of either dry season Boro rice production or wheat production, etc., to a much more diverse production system is possible with irrigation, etc. And solar energy can play a big role in helping on the irrigation side there. Carbon capture, certainly that's an important part of what we think of as zero hunger, zero carbon systems. And some of the opportunities there in agriculture is to look at zero tillage system, crop residue management, incorporating of crop residues, etc., along with the agroforestry systems where that's possible. But yes, that's very much a part of what needs to happen. On demand side changes, I completely agree. Part of what I think of behavior change is demand side changes. But we're in this very curious situation in India where the demand for protein is rising rapidly, and demand for milk is rising rapidly, and livestock products. So we can't, at the one hand, say, poor need access to better nutrition and better protein, but then limit their access to the same. So we need to find a balance there on how to get to affordable protein for the populations in the country. Pastoral systems, I must admit, when I think of pastoral systems, I think of Africa, not India. So it's something that I need to learn more about. Maybe you can teach me some more. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, just two quick responses. One is the landscape, model. I do agree that convergence is still something that's very elusive. Every attempt at various levels have not had the kind of impact that we would like to have. I am a believer that we probably need to look at convergence at the district level for want of any other proper administrative division. Ideally, weather-related geographies are much better. But district level convergence, I think we need to redo our planning to ensure that these resources converge at that point of delivery rather than, and the rest has to be an enabling thing. On the pastoral system, my only comment is I think we need to look at our commons very seriously. They've been encroached, taken over, even by government in some cases. And I think the first thing that we can do probably is to restore commons back as commons and then look at the rest of it. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like just to make a couple of remarks really following Prabhu's beautiful keynote. First of all, connected conversations. If that is going to be a vitally important part of moving forward, then we as a group need to think quite hard about how we can contribute to better connected conversations. After all, we've all taken the trouble to come here this Monday morning to this dialogue. We've left our other work behind, so we are committed as a group to try to get it right. Let's think hard about connection. I want to say a couple of words more about that. Let's also keep thinking about this issue of hidden costs. Some people talk about it in terms of the true costs, but there will always be different views about what should be included and what should be excluded. This is where the work of the Food Economics Commission, which will be discussed on day 3, is so important. Let's hold that one. Thirdly, I wrote down here liabilities that lie in wait. There are going to be challenges in the coming 5 years, 10 years, 15 years because of climate change and because of this specific challenge in India of water shortage that are just going to get worse. And we should anticipate them rather than be shocked by them when they come. Now on convergence, do you know the word that I heard most often in Dubai at COP28, especially in the agriculture and food discussions, was convergence. It's right there inside the declaration, but it's also in people's heads. It's hard to do convergence if you're dealing in landscapes. Why? Because there's very rarely a jurisdiction at a landscape level. And to do convergence, you need to be functioning inside a jurisdiction where there is authority. Otherwise, it's just talk. So I think linking convergence to jurisdictions is not a bad idea. So here in India, it's super clear: the block, the district, the state. They're the jurisdictional points. And then within that, we find synergies and opportunities. And then lastly, just to say that the mention of agrovoltaics by Prabhu Pingali would have got him big claps from the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, which did a major statement about the declaration that was developed in UAE. They complained that there was insufficient attention to the energy use in agriculture and the need to shift towards renewables. So if we could perhaps see more of that come shining up from the India examples that the rest want to be hearing. So connected conversations and convergence, agrovoltaics and working at jurisdictional level are all things where India has got masses to share with the rest of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been the beginning of our dialogue. Absolutely fabulous presentations. Could we please have a big, big hand for everybody? And we ran a little late, but I think the organisers were okay about that. So we go in now to a 15-minute tea break before going into the thematic session run by the Shakti Foundation, who will be coming after the tea break, right? Thank you very much. Good.